Now we come to our text this morning from the Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 3 through 17. You find Psalms in the middle of your Bible. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon. We'll start on page 673 in your Geneva Bible. And we will finish the second chapter this morning. Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 3 through 17. Beginning at verse 3 of chapter 2. Like the apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my well-beloved among the sons of men. Under his shadow had I delight, and sat down, and his fruit was sweet to my mouth. He brought me into the wine cellar, and love was his banner over me. Stay me with flagons, and comfort me with apples, for I am sick of love. His left hand is under mine head, and his right hand doth embrace me. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that ye stir not up, nor waken my love until she please. It is the voice of my well-beloved. Behold, he cometh, leaping by the mountains and skipping by the hills. My well-beloved is like a roe or a young hart. Lo, he standeth behind our wall, looking forth of the windows, showing himself through the grates. My well-beloved spake and said unto me, Arise, my love, my fair one, and come thy way. For behold, winter is past, the rain is changed and is gone away. The flowers appear in the earth. The time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. The fig tree hath brought forth her young figs, and the vines with their small grapes have cast a savour. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. My dove, that art in the holes of the rock, in the secret places of the stairs, show me thy sight. Let me hear thy voice, for thy voice is sweet, and thy sight comely. Take us the foxes, the little foxes which destroy the vines, for our vines have small grapes. My well-beloved is mine, and I am his. He feedeth among the lilies, until the daybreak and the shadows flee away. Return, my well-beloved, and be like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of Bethel. It is the church, the bride, who is the main speaker in our sermon this morning. The title of our message this morning, Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 3 through 17, The Near Presence and Distance of Christ. And that is in the life of a believer in the church. The near presence and distance of Christ. Our introduction. Man was once perfectly happy because he was in perfect union with Christ. The presence of Christ dwelt with Adam in the garden perfectly every minute of the day. Then came the fall, in which man lost perfect communion with God. This lost communion meant there would be long periods of time in which God might be distant from us, such as the distance David often records in the Psalms. This union was restored by the promise and coming of Christ, yet will not be fully restored until we are in the permanent presence of Christ. Since our ultimate happiness is being in the presence of Christ in heaven, we should long for his presence as much as possible here on earth. There are 2 points to our message this morning. In verses 3 through 7, the church's comfort when in the presence of Christ. And in verses 8 through 17, the church's loneliness when Christ is distant. Now the context of our verses this morning. Loneliness is the feeling of being separate from those we love. Christians experience this loneliness when they are outside the presence of Christ. Non-believers are largely unaware that their unhappiness is caused by their perpetual absence from the presence of Christ. The lost seek to fill this loneliness from God with entertainment, human companionship, and other earthly objects, but ultimately go through life lonely without even knowing why. In our text this morning, the church describes the pleasant company of Christ as he exists constantly in the thoughts of sincere believers. In verses 3 to 7, the church describes what great uninterrupted fellowship it may enjoy when in the presence of Christ, when it is able to clear itself from the troubles of this world. However, in verses 8 through 17, all has changed. And the church seems at a distance, which can be the result of sin or just the problems and daily cares of living in the world. As the bride is lonely for the bridegroom, so the church is remedied in these verses by advice on how it may return itself to the presence of Christ when he appears to us to be at a distance. We begin with our first point, verses 3 to 7. The church's great comfort when in the presence of Christ. Verse 3. This is the bride speaking, and she's complimenting Christ. Christ is the apple tree here. Like the apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my well-beloved among the sons of men. Under his shadow had I delight, and sat down, and his fruit was sweet unto my mouth. The bride begins with an analogy. As an apple tree would be out of place in a forest, so Christ is out of place among the sons of men, or in comparison to the sons of men. In the previous verse from last week, you'll remember that Christ had just called the church a lily among thorns, referring to the attributes of a lily, that it is pure and white and clean and tender, but it must exist among the worthless and harmful thorns. So now the church returns this compliment by saying that Christ is like an apple tree among the wild trees of the forest. An apple tree, of course, is a useful tree. It bears fruit and provides nourishment for those who make use of it. The wild, barren trees of the forest differ. They offer nothing by way of fruit and cannot be compared in worth to a tree that can bear fruit, such as the apple tree. The other half of the analogy is the comparison between Christ and the sons of men. As Christ is like the apple tree, the sons of men are like the wild trees in the barren forest. As the apple tree bears fruit, Christ is also fruit-bearing towards his church. The sons of men here are similar to the daughters of Jerusalem in that they represent worldly evildoers. As the apple tree has greater worth than the wild, barren trees, the bride is saying, so Christ has far greater worth than the wicked, sinful sons of men. The church requires the companionship of Christ beyond that of the sons of men because it bears so much more fruit in comparison. Next, the church explains why the experience of living under the shadow of Christ is superior to living among the sons of men. We're told that the church finds safety from the heat of the world under the shade of Christ. It is a delightful shade to be in the presence of Christ, and we may sit and rest under his easy yoke. Union with Christ, it goes on to say in verse 3, is sweet to the mouth. As this fruit refers to the graces offered by Christ, because Christ offers grace and the sons of men offer trouble, there's no comparison between the two. So we see that the apple tree is Christ and the sons of men are the wild trees. Verse 4, he goes on. The bride goes on to talk about her great love for Christ. He, Christ, brought me into the wine cellar, and love was his banner over me. Next, the church explains how she came to be a partaker of the sweet fruit or spiritual union which is in Christ. She says plainly that he brought me. Christ brought us into his salvation. We did not come to Christ on our own, but were brought by him to our salvation. Christ himself performed all the actions associated with our conversion. He brings us into his presence. And that's why she says, the church, he brought me. Christ, having drawn us to himself by his Spirit, now metaphorically refers to that place wherein his presence dwells as the wine cellar. He brought us to himself. He brought us into his wine cellar. Why does it say that Christ brought us into his wine cellar? In the homes of the rich are wine cellars with the finest aged wines. Of all the precious foods and drink, aged wines are, of course, the most valuable. Christ invites his people unto himself, and then he gives them his very best. He does not give us a small taste of his goodness, but brings us down to the wine cellar, where lies that wine that is most valuable, and offers it to us in unrestrained abundance. So Christ is giving us the best of himself. The best of himself is represented by the wine cellar. The verse also explains what compelled Christ to draw his elect. Why did Christ draw his elect? It was love. The phrase says, his banner over us was love. That is what compelled him to choose us. A banner is a flag with which an army defines who they are and their cause, such as in a war. The cause or banner here listed by which Christ saved us was for the sake of his own love. Not only did Christ choose to set his love upon us, he drew us unto himself in the most loving manner possible. The elect were gathered to receive the greatest riches that Christ had to offer, the wine cellar, not due to anything lovely about us, but according to his lovely nature. So we're brought into the greatest of places, his presence, here represented by the wine cellar, not from anything in us, but merely because of his love for his elect before the foundations of the world. Verse 5, the bride goes on in her rapturous state, and she says, "Stay me with flagons and comfort me with apples, for I am sick of love." As the bride, which is the church, considers these loving principles, she's overwhelmed. Like a person who loves wine and is invited to partake of the greatest of all the wine cellars, she is likewise overwhelmed by Christ's goodness. Her condition is that she is sick of love. This is not meant to mean that she is tired of love. It's not that kind of sickness. Or has had enough and doesn't want any more. But that she is overwhelmed to sickness by the goodness of it. She cannot fathom anything so good and perfect, and is overwhelmed that she should be the recipient of such a love. Because the love of Christ seems so good and so opposed to her sinful condition, she refers to it as making her sick. For anything like the love of Christ that is so foreign to our system, our sinful nature, causes us to become sick. It's too much of a good thing, but we desire it. It's a good sickness. The love of Christ is so undeserving that it overwhelms her like a sickness overwhelms us. With the problem of sickness comes the need for a cure. She suggests two cures. Stay me with flagons and comfort me with apples. She is in need of two things in her condition. She needs someone to stay me, which means to catch me, because I am weak and fainting. And she needs someone to comfort me, because she is in a rapturous state, sick of love, the overwhelming goodness of it. A flagon is a flask for storing wine, and refers back to verse 4, where she is invited into the wine cellar. And her desire to be comforted with apples in this verse harps back to verse 3, where she refers to Christ as an apple tree among the wild trees of the forest. Her cure is more of the same. She desires Christ to stay me with flagons, meaning rescue me from fainting by offering more of your good graces, such as the wine. And she says, comfort me with apples, which explains her desire to abide always with Christ, who she previously in verse 3 called the apple tree, and be comforted by his presence in the shade of the apple tree from verse 3. Christ and his good graces will cure her sickness. She desires more of that sickness. Verse 6, his left hand is under mine hand, and his right hand doth embrace me. As she's just said, to catch me because I'm falling and comfort me because I'm sick. Here, Christ does that. His left hand is under her head to catch her, and his right hand doth embrace me to comfort her. In verse 5, the church asks Christ to catch her, for she is falling due to love sickness, and comfort her, for she is overwhelmed by the near union and love she feels from Christ. And here in verse 6, Christ does keep her from falling. His left hand is under mine head, she says, and does comfort her, and his right hand doth embrace me. The church confesses that Christ draws near to us at times, causing us to swoon and faint with love from him. It's so overwhelming and it's so undeserved. And that Christ also does comfort us when we feel unworthily the recipients of his goodness, for we must feel unworthy. Remember in earlier verses, the church is black because it's humble. It realizes it's a sinful church and it needs the goodness of Christ. But when the goodness of Christ's church comes to such a black thing, it's humiliating to us. When we feel unworthily the recipients of this great goodness that comes from Christ that's so undeserving in our bodies. Yet Christ does also embrace us when we are far from his presence and does bring us comfort whenever we sin and fall short. And then she says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that ye stir not up nor awaken my love until she please. In the previous verse ends with the bride swooning in the arms and presence of Christ. He's now literally holding her in his arms. But also present from a distance, she sees the daughters of Jerusalem, which you remember always cause her to lose the presence of Christ because they're worldly. She spies them from a distance and she cries out to them, scolds them. They are to come no closer. They are not to bring trouble, for they are not to disturb the restful union she has with Christ. And this is so often the case, that we find solace and pleasant ideas in our solitude to dwell upon as if in the very presence of Christ. Yet, as is so often the case, our peaceful union in this world is so often interrupted by the fallen world. And trouble takes our minds into the earthly realm of sin and consequences, and our private union with Christ is destroyed. She wishes for the trouble of the world to go away so she can enjoy the direct presence of Christ. But we all know us being in the presence of Christ is so often destroyed by the worldly troubles. She goes on. The expression, by the roes and by the hinds of the field, that you stir not up. This is referring to the idea that cattle often graze peacefully in a field. But the slightest approach by another animal or an unknown or loud sound may cause them to stir. The shepherd, of course, has an easy, peaceful day if the cattle graze peacefully and quietly, but an awful day if they are stirred up. Like the shepherd, the believer desires to remain in the calm presence of Christ and not be stirred from it by the trouble that so often comes from the wicked world. So she tells the daughters of Jerusalem to get away from her and not stir her up so she can enjoy the presence of Christ. And now we come to our second point, verses 8 to 17. The church's loneliness when Christ is distant. Of course, we're to see this as the loneliness in our own personal lives also when Christ is distant from us. Verses 8 and 9. It is the voice of my well-beloved. Behold, he cometh leaping by the mountains and skipping by the hills. My well-beloved is like a roe or a young hart. Lo, he standeth behind our wall, looketh forth of the window, showing himself through the grates. For the remainder of these verses, we have a different setting than we did in verses 3 through 7. While in verse 7, the church dwelt in the comfort of Christ's arms and in his lively presence, inevitably we saw in verse 7 the daughters of Jerusalem come and the world has interfered with this presence. As this is the case, trouble has caused the elect church to view Christ often at a distance. But this text tells us what we ought to do when we find ourselves separated from Christ. First, in verses 8 to 9, we'll look at we should observe Christ as best we can, even when he is from a distance. And secondly, in verses 10 to 15, we should record what he has said and read it over and over again in our minds to comfort ourselves. And thirdly, in verses 16 to 17, it teaches us that we should comfort ourselves in the hopes of future enjoyment amidst his coming and near presence. Here in these verses, Christ is pictured as he cometh leaping by the mountains and skipping by the hills. We notice he's near, but not very near. He's distant, but somewhat near. From this we learn that Christ is not present, but distant. Physically speaking, Christ is always at a distance. But spiritually, there are times in which Christ is more and less distant. And while he is always spiritually present to a degree with all believers, this distance we're talking about is more our sense of his presence to us being distant. This distance is not necessarily caused by sin. We're not only distant from God because of sin, but could be caused by a busy work week where we just do not dwell upon him as much as we should, and other time-consuming activities which keep us from dwelling upon him. We also notice that while Christ is absent, he is also very near. He's not in our direct presence, but he is near. Even in this analogy, he draws near and is in sight. Notice it says, he standeth behind our wall, looking forth of the windows, showing himself through the gate. These are all images of him being near, but not near enough, not in our direct, immediate presence. Just as a loving husband may temporarily be apart from his wife, such as is used in this metaphor as of being behind our wall, looking forth of the windows, or showing himself through the grate, yet he is still near. And though a loving husband may be at a distance where he cannot attend to the immediate needs of his wife or converse with her, he is near and soon to return to manifest his care for her. And likewise, although at times Christ seems at a distance, he is always near enough to meet our immediate needs of union. Next, verses 10 to 13, they should all be taken together, saying the same thing. My well-beloved spake and said unto me, Arise, my love, my fair one, and come thy way. For behold, winter is past, the rain is changed and is gone away. The flowers appear in the earth, the time of the singing of birds is come, and the voice of the turtle is heard in our land. The fig tree hath brought forth her young figs, and the vines with their small grapes have cast a savour. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away. Here the church is still pictured as a bride that is distant from her husband. We notice that while the church is different from Christ, she does well to remember what he said to her. Notice what she says. My well-beloved spake and said unto me. Since we're distant from Christ, we should dwell upon his words to us. Since the church cannot yet be in the immediate presence of Christ, it must find Christ in his words. The word of Christ teaches us that the word of Christ teaches us what we should do. When the world has taken us from his union and presence, we're told that we should arise and come thy way. These words imply that when we are not in close union with Christ, we are lonely. And as if dead, we need to arise. We must use his word to enliven our faith and come the way that the Scriptures encourage. We are further encouraged here in these verses by the titles given by Christ to his church. Notice here in verse 10, calling her my love, my fair one, which do show that he loves us and desires that we return to his presence. And there is no reason we should be frightened or delay for a moment to return. The winter cold and the storm, we're told in verse 11, have passed, and the rain that makes rivers impassable and journeys dangerous, we're told in verse 12, is gone. The winter refers to that season in which our love has turned cold or been set aside by some earthly distraction. The rain and storm are our own doing. They are roadblocks that we have set up in our trivial doings that delay our returning to union with Christ. But Christ, we're told, has remained these distractions that we have set up. And the path back to his presence is clear and unimpeded. Winter and the storm have passed because Christ has removed them so we can enter again into his presence. Christ has made, we're told in verse 12, the flowers to appear in the earth, as well as the singing of birds and the voice of the turtle. The winter has created, we're told, in our heart, and is now set aside, and Christ has replaced the winter that is within our heart with a lively spring. As the flower lies dormant under the winter ground, so the faith lies dormant when it is removed from the presence of Christ. But Christ, who is often called the Son of Righteousness, has warmed the hearts, and the lively faith of the believers return. This causes the heart to sing praises to Christ as the singing of birds and the voice of the turtle dove signify that spring has come. So the lively spring has come to the heart, and the bridegroom, at least in a spiritual presence, is returned. You can see how this is one long metaphor for how Christ removes the things that keep us from his union and presence in our life. As winter gives way to spring, spring, we're told, gives way to summer. The believer moves from a winter of the heart to a spring in which the graces of Christ are soon alive and exercised. This livelier faith, we're told, bears greater fruit and is represented by the fig tree that hath brought forth her young fruits, in verse 13, as well as the vines with their small grapes. In other words, our winter has turned into spring, and our spring desires to bear the fruit of summer. That is the result of the nearer and nearer presence of Christ. This series of verses ends as it began, with Christ again calling his bride to return to him. He beckons, "Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away." Christ only knows what is best for his church as its king and head, and once again implores his church to come away from the world, the sons of men, the daughters of Jerusalem, and return unto his holy presence. Verse 14, "My dove, that art," this is still the bride remembering the words of Christ. So it sounds like Christ is speaking, but it's really just the bride remembering the words of Christ to her as advice. "My dove," it seems to say that Christ is saying, "that art in the holes of the rock, in the secret places of the stairs, show me thy sight. Let me hear thy voice, for thy voice is sweet and thy sight comely." The church remembers the words of Christ, who compares the church when it is at a distance to a mourning dove that's hiding in the stairs or the rocks. For no other bird loves their mate like the dove. That's why he uses the dove as a metaphor. And none is as sad and mournful as when they are separated. When the dove is afraid, it hides in various places, such as in the holes of the rock or in the secret places of the stairs. Christ shows that he did not hide from his church, but the believer hid from his presence. Now Christ calls his church away from those places in which it hid from his presence, and to show me thy sight, and let me hear thy voice, which refers to our coming before him in our presence and his presence and making ourselves known to him. To show ourselves means to outwardly appear to stand for Christ, such as when we gather in public worship. And to allow our voice to be heard refers to the singing of psalms and the act of prayer. For obedience to his ordinances of public worship and psalm singing and prayer, we're told, is sweet to the ears of Christ, in which he commends us by the words, "For thy voice is sweet." And diligent attendance upon public worship is beautiful in his sight. Or as Christ states that our attendance to his ordinances is a comely sight. So the church is called to his greater presence through public worship. Verse 15, this is the bride saying to Christ, "Take us the foxes, the little foxes," which is another way of saying take away the foxes, "the little foxes, which destroy the vines, for our vines have small grape." Here the church regards its helpless estate. The church is often referred to in the Scriptures as a vineyard or a vine, such as in Matthew chapter 22 or Isaiah 5:7, which shows forth Christ separating believers into his vineyard and our need as a church to bear fruit as does a good vine. The foxes are the false teachers in the church. Ezekiel 13:4 uses the same analogy of harmful false prophets within the church. He says, O Israel, thy false prophets are like the foxes in the deserts. In Luke 13:32, Herod is likewise called a fox. Foxes are clever in the manner in which they destroy the vines in the vineyard. And likewise, false teachers are clever in the manner that they corrupt the purity of doctrine, or in the way that they obscure the purity of worship and bring confusion and disunity among the church's members and extinguish the presence of Christ within the church. The cure for this, we're told, is faithful preaching and censoring of all false prophets by the church. The phrase, take us the foxes, means to take them away. As men of old hunted foxes to preserve their vineyards, so the false prophets must be hunted and taken away by the gospel ministry so that they are exposed in their error, refuted and sent away before they do any more harm. For the grapes of the church, we're told, are tender and small in learning, meaning many in the church are easily deceived, young in the faith, tender in knowledge. And therefore these foxes must be treated with great force and driven from the congregation. And finally in 16 to 17, what happens is what happens so often when David writes his Psalms. Christ's presence seems far away. He prays, and at the end of the psalm, Christ's presence swoops in, and David is once again comforted, once again being in the union of Christ. And that's what we see also here in these final verses 16 to 17. She's comforted. She says, my beloved is mine. She feels the return of his presence. And I am his. He feedeth among the lilies. Until the daybreak and the shadows flee away, return, my well-beloved, and be like a roe or a young hart upon the mountain of Bethel. Having recalled the words of Christ in verses 10 to 15, the bride is now comforted. Her faith is fully clear, and her hope returned unto her. His presence restored, as she says, my well-beloved is mine, and I am his. He doesn't feel so distant anymore. The church is in covenant with Christ. He is the inseparable bridegroom by promise and assurance. The church is free to remind herself that she will eternally belong to Christ, especially when he feels distance. She is to remind herself that we are eternally his, and persevere by the power and promise of Christ, that when he is distant, he will return. But the daughters of Jerusalem, or the sons of men, may ask the bride, and that's what they're doing in verse 16, well, why can he not be seen? To which the church answers, he feedeth among the lilies. Christ is the bridegroom of the whole church. He cannot be seen as he is in heaven caring for the whole church. For now we are physically separated from Christ due to our sins and our weakness. But this, we're told, will soon change. There will be a day in which Christ is no longer seen as shadows that flee away, as it says in our verse. But we will see him face to face. That time must wait, we're told, until the daybreak. But on that day, known only to the Father, Christ will return, and we will be fully restored to his presence. Until that time, the church asks that Christ will be like a roe or a young hart upon the mountains of Bethel. As the roe and hart periodically make appearances on the mountains, so Christ should draw near with his presence often until that time when we are fully in his presence, until the daybreak when he returns. The word Bethel means division, and as the mountains divide us from the roe or young hart, so we are temporarily divided from Christ. But this is a temporary condition, and we must remember, as does the bride, that he is mine and I am his until we are together in full.